So I actually had to make a correction to who was here last 2 weeks ago. I guess was the last time. It's been a few weeks. So I had to make a little correction. So we had Jonathan Gingrich and Ryan Kennedy were kind of raising a lot of questions about this whole distant starlight thing and talking about time dilation and how young Earth creationists respond to this. So the basic idea between distant starlight is that these stars are billions of light years away, and it takes light a certain amount of time to get here. We have these units of, I guess, time called light years, right? So it would take light, however many years to get to us from whatever star, right? So if a star is 20 billion light years away, actually that might be too far, 4 billion light years away, then it would take 4 billion years to get here, right? That's the whole idea. Now, so there's two young Earth responses. I kind of went over the top one. It's pretty quick. So God could have just created the light beam already in place. It didn't actually have to travel that distance, right? So that's kind of their first response. But this other one's called time dilation, right? And the way time dilation works, and the way I characterize it, there's two different kinds of time dilation, which I didn't realize the last time I made this presentation. I thought there was just one, called relative velocity time dilation, which is kind of a weird thing, but okay, I'm sitting still right here. Technically, someone that's walking by out in the fellowship hall, time is moving slower for that person. Of course, it's in the most infinitesimal of fraction of a second, but and you would really only notice it if you were going very, very fast. So they've done it with planes going over, high over the Earth, going at super fast speeds, where they've actually detected the time slowing down for them, which is weird, right? But that's not actually. So I was trying to use that form of time dilation to describe how light coming to Earth could be explained. It's not that one though. So let me just push that to a side for a second. It's gravitational time dilation. So apparently we're on a very large mass called Earth, right? So whenever you're near a very large gravitational mass, time moves slower for you. Okay. Now light that's moving through space is most of the time not near any kind of mass. It's kind of in space. So it's not near a star, it's not near a planet, it's just usually not near anything. So it's not near any kind of mass. So it's going to move, time is going to move very fast for that light as it's coming here because it's not near any large gravitational mass. And so we can since we're near this Earth, time is moving slower for us. So I don't know if you guys remember this. Carolyn, you were here 2 weeks ago, but
I think I was here for this one.
For this one?
Sure.
Okay.
So we're trying to figure out if light years is adjusted for the time that it takes things to move through space.
Yes.
So when you say 4 billion light years,
Right.
Is that our time or is that?
That's the big question. Scientists are talking about it in our time. So that's how they're referring to it. Time is very flexible, and that's not what they're accounting for, because in the Bible, we don't know what time they're referring to. There's actually this is kind of a tangent, but if God was really stretching the universe out in the beginning, like it says he was, out of something like a black hole, we would have, there are certain reasons to believe. So when you look at the expansion of the universe, it's expanding away from us in every single direction, which would indicate that we're actually at the center of the universe, which is a strange idea. Kind of fits with, I think, the Bible, that we are important in a way, and I don't see why we couldn't be the center of the universe, but because everything is expanding away from us, making us the center, where was I going with that? I lost my train of thought.
Was it the time dilation you're talking about?
There was, gravitational time dilation. Oh, stretching. So he would have been stretching us out of potentially a black hole. Now, in a black hole, time doesn't move at all. There's zero time moving. Now, as you're pulling things out though into a time-space universe, time starts moving. And so, say the first things that are going to be pulled out are going to be the furthest away from us. Time starts ticking for them. But time's not ticking for us yet because we're still in the black hole. But say if we're the last thing to get pulled out, we could potentially be 6,000 years old, while things 10 billion light years away are actually 10 billion years old. So isn't that kind of a crazy thought, that it shows you how time is different depending on where you are in the universe?
It is hard to even think about that, but yeah.
It's weird because we think of time as this very.
I'm not sure
I don't fully understand it. Yeah, just accept. But as far as gravitational time dilation goes, it's just a simple concept that time is going to move faster for light because it's not near a gravitational body for it than it would for us. Therefore, when you're looking at light, it might look like it's, a million years old, but it's actually still, from our spot, only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. So it's kind of a cool idea. Another thing to tack onto that is we don't actually know the one-way speed of light. So we only know the speed of light in two directions because we can't actually, in order to time, so if you were to time light leaving from, say, a flashlight to get to another point, you would have to have two timers. You can't actually synchronize two timers. It's another physical reality. And so the only way that you could actually do that is to shine it off a mirror and have only one timer. So you time how long it takes light to leave from one light source, bounce off a mirror, and come back and shut it off. Because the second that you have two, you now have to synchronize them, and there's just no physical way of doing that, because as soon as, say if you were to start them both here, if you move the timer, it's now dilated. It's you had to move it. Anytime you move something, time changes for it. And so they can't actually synchronize it. If say there was some way, there's really no way to start two timers at the same time either, because you need some sort of signal to do that. And the signal moves at the speed of light. So you're assuming that you know the speed of light when you're making that calculation. So yeah. So because we don't know the one-way speed of light, we don't know that time changes, or that light changes its speed depending on its direction. So light coming towards us could be moving at, say, infinite speed, right? So when we look at the stars in the night sky, we're actually seeing events as they're happening. It's happening right now. If we see a supernova, a star blows up, it's happening right now, not however many million years ago. Right? Are you guys following? Is that okay? Believe me, I had to stare at the computer trying to think this stuff through. Yeah. So that's kind of, these are all the theories that essentially young Earth creationists put out there to try to explain how the universe might not be as old as we think it is. Because of the way time moves and light moves. Just some interesting stuff. I thought it was, even if it's kind of above my pedigree. But yeah, that was all. I think the only one. The only thing I wanted else. Yeah, so I didn't get the last slide on old Earth creationism, so we gotta finish that up. And okay. So the last time we were talking, was this 2 weeks ago in our class, we were going over old Earth creationism. So these are the basic principles of why they say that the Bible indicates that the 6 days of creation were not 24-hour days. So this might kind of jog your memory a little bit. So a day in Hebrew, which is yom, doesn't necessarily refer to a 24-hour day. There are other times in the Bible when it's referring to daylight or, just a general day in the Lord or whatever. So they say that because of these other instances of that, it's not necessarily referring to a 24-hour cycle. Then the sun's not created until day 4. There's no sunrise between days 1 through 3. Typically in our conventions, when we're talking about a day, there's a sunrise and a sunset, especially back then, right? There's no clocks, in the beginning of time. So, our conventions, we would use the sun as that indicator. If there's no sun, then what is a day? So they kind of raise that question. The Bible suggests that the Sabbath day is ongoing, right? So if there's certain parts of the Bible that actually indicate that the Sabbath day hasn't ended, so they kind of use that. Well, if the Sabbath day hasn't ended, then why would days 1 through 6 be 24-hour days? Number 4, I don't like that one, but I'll say it again. Unreasonable amount of activity on day 6 for one 24-hour day, particularly talking about the animals, saying that if Adam had to name at least 2,500 animals, that's too many for him to do. My opinion is that I don't know what Adam was capable of. Maybe he was capable of naming 2,500 animals, so I don't think that's a good one. But then the last one is that the Sabbath rests were in years as well as days. There are other instances where, Saturday is what we typically think of as being the Sabbath for Jews, right? But there were other forms of Sabbaths, right? So every 7 years you would rest your land. Every 7 years, so every 49 years you would have a Jubilee, right? Which was kind of a Sabbath too, where you would forgive debts and such. So there's all these different kinds of Sabbaths. Now, of course, the young Earth creation is going, well, those are years. It's saying, every 7th year. It's not saying every 7th day, which in Genesis it's saying on the seventh day. So they can volley that back and forth till, Jesus comes back, pretty much. But then we have, so this is really the one that I think is an interesting proposition. So animal death before the fall poses Yeah, so young earth creationists say that old earth creationism causes gospel problems, right? And so this is their response to that. And so the way that this is premised, let me see, yeah, let's just bring all that up. So is they look to Romans 5:12, where it says, that Adam sinned, and because he sinned, then death came into the world, right? And they say that, if we have animal death before the fall, well, what does that mean? It means that there was death before the fall. And so how does that work, right? And so basically the old earth response to that is that it's not talking about, Paul is not talking about animal death in that instance. He's saying that human death was inspired by that, and more specifically, even spiritual death, would have been, the real thing that is being spoken about in that moment. So, and to kind of make their case, old earthers will say that Adam actually knew what death was prior to the fall. And so in Genesis 2:17, it says that in the day that you eat of it, this is God speaking, in the day that you eat of the tree of good and evil, you shall surely die. And so if this statement is going to be made, well, it would seem to indicate that Adam had some idea of what God was talking about. If you say that you shall surely die, you can't say that, and if he has no idea what death is, then it's meaningless to him. And so old earthers will say that he probably observed it in the plant kingdom or the animal kingdom. There was some form of death going on. That's kind of what they kind of make out of that. The Hebrew word for beasts, which is chaya in the Hebrew, most often refers to carnivores. So they kind of try to make the case that maybe there were still carnivorous animals before the fall. You can't really make that case because in Genesis 1 it talks about them all being vegetarian. So I don't know why that's in there, but she put that in there, the author, so I felt like I had to put it in there. Very good, as said by God, can include animal death. So you might remember at the end of day 6, God says that is very good. And young earthers will say that it can't be very good if things are already dying. It means that it's been tainted in some way already. But old earthers will make the case that very good doesn't necessarily mean no death. When we talk about meat today, we put meat on the table. That's tov. It's a practical benefit. There's an economic benefit going on there, and we would not say that it was not very good to feed your kids meat or your husband meat or whatever. It's still very good. It could have been very well part of God's design to have animals dying prior to the fall. That's kind of the case they're making. Fourth one we kind of already labored a little bit. So sin caused the death of all men, not men and animals. Let me see if I can just bring up. So Romans 5:12. So death spread to all men because all sinned. So that's the specific verse. And they really kind of hone in on all men, right? It doesn't say all men and animals because all sin. And actually, you can put all sin as because all men sinned too. That would be the implication there. And then finally, that last one is, if all who were made alive in Christ are human, all who died from Adam were also humans. This is a reference to 1 Corinthians 15:22, which says, for in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. And kind of making a similar case to the last one. So if all who were made alive in Christ are humans, so, it's not our guinea pigs that are made alive in Christ, right? It's us. It's only humans that are made alive in Christ. And therefore, likewise, it would have been all of us that were caused, to die from Adam as well. So that's kind of the cumulative case or the cumulative response of old earthers to young earthers with the idea or the challenge that holding an old earth view causes gospel problems. And actually, they'll push back a little bit and say that young earthers cause their own gospel problems, not necessarily in the content, but in the practice. In our ability to witness Jesus to others, specifically one that's very committed to naturalism. Maybe not in Lancaster County. Lancaster County is a nice little bubble. But when you go outside of Lancaster County into more urban areas or suburban areas, many areas are very committed to naturalism, and they accept something like evolution as just fact. It's not even questionable at this point. In fact, you'll even watch I think there was some episode of Friends I was reading lately where Phoebe or something says something like, "Oh, I don't believe in evolution or whatever."
I know.
You know what episode I'm talking about? Yep. And Joey responds and he says, "You can't just buy evolution. It's just you can't buy reality." But that's generally how our culture accepts something like evolution.
It's Ross.
Is it Ross?
He's the paleontologist, so he's like, what do you mean? You have to, what are you, he spends the entire episode trying to convince her, and she's like, I just don't believe it.
Really? Okay.
It's funny, they're poking fun of it.
Yeah.
It actually is a good point. You can just not believe in stuff that they're telling you. That's okay. It's
Right.
a viable thing to do.
Right. I mean,
could not get over the fact that she just doesn't believe it.
right. And I mean, it's really a matter of, you want to look at the evidence too, because there is another side to this, and that's what we're going to talk to. I don't know if we'll get to all of it today, because there's a whole other section to this that we have to get to. But intelligent design, there's a pretty significant case to be made for intelligent design, which is the response to something like evolution. A lot, and it actually has.
Crazy amounts of evidence.
Yes, so I'm looking forward to getting into that. I'm hoping to actually devote eventually an entire class to that, because I think that would be a good one to cover.
Fascinating, really.
Yeah, but they kind of say, if we are now committed to a view that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago, we have to deny radiometric dating, we have to deny all these things that people accept as being solid fact. Well, this is now a barrier in order to get someone to the gospel, because it's more important, honestly, that's my goal, right, is to get someone to accept that we all sin, right? We all are in need of forgiveness, that there is a God, right? That we can talk about God. The belief of what Genesis 1 has explained doesn't mean that God doesn't exist, right? Is it affecting the 5 core biblical doctrines? Does God exist? Is Jesus' deity affected? Did the resurrection happen? Are we all sinners? Is it faith alone that saves us? Like, all these things are still in place, whether you have an old earth or a young earth view. Neither of them are impacted by that. And so if we can get someone to kind of see the truth of those 5 core biblical doctrines, and maybe just kind of say, well, there's this old earth view, if this kind of fits better with your model of reality for now. I mean, maybe once they accept the authority of the Bible, they might consider the young earth view, but don't make that a barrier if you don't have to. Kind of know what I'm saying? And that's what old earth will contend. You're putting a barrier to the gospel that's kind of unnecessary. Because it honestly is. I feel like for a lot of the culture out there, they think that we have to basically give up on all science in order to believe in Jesus, which is just a total misconception of what it means to be a Christian. So, make sense? Yeah, that's the old earth view. But okay, so let's come out of that and move on to the new stuff. So here we go, and play from the start. All right, week 11. So this is actually the final section of the book, so that we're going to be getting into, and then we're going to be moving on to a new subject entirely. Switching gears a lot. We're doing a book called Tactics. Probably start that in like 2 or 3 weeks. That's more like how you kind of engage other people, but giving you kind of ways that you can kind of maintain control in those conversations so that you're not constantly on the defensive. It's actually very practical. It doesn't sound as interesting. We get into some interesting discussions, though, in the book. So it's not just like, I don't know, just dry arguments. Okay, so let's come out of there. We already talked about that. Okay, so we're going to talk about basically evolution today. Hopefully we can now just know I'm going to be giving you the scientist or naturalistic scientist case for evolution. Now, there was a response to this. We might not get to the response today. So don't leave today thinking like, oh no, this is like, don't let your world come crashing down upon you. But we don't want to straw man it, right? We don't want to not misrepresent what scientists actually believe and why they believe what they believe. So we're going to kind of just go through that today. So what is evolution? So it simply means that a species has undergone genetic change over time. That's all it means, right? And this is actually uncontroversial. So genetic change, dogs, for example, they were just wolves at one time, basically, and now you have, teacup Yorkshire Terrier, and you also have a Great Dane. So there's this variation that didn't exist before, but it does now. So you have genetic change over time. Now, of course, what do you have to note about the dog situation? Do they ever become lizards? No. They've never made it so that you could take like a wolf and turn it into a pterodactyl, or that doesn't happen, right? So they're always, and I guess pterodactyls are probably controversial in their own way, but a Komodo dragon, right? That's something that actually exists. You don't see this cross-species type of evolution, right? And that's really where it gets more controversial, because evolutionary theory, right here, ET, seeks to explain how all life evolved from a single species that lived approximately 3.5 billion years ago. I feel like I have to mention this. So there's this guy named Dr. Richard Lenski, who's been, this is quite the hobby, isn't it? So he tracked an array of genetic mutations in E. coli. Okay, so he's had these petri dishes of E. coli since 1988. Okay, and this book was written in like 2017, so at least, like 30 years he's had this, these petri dishes of E. coli, and he was monitoring just the mutations of them over time. And over 60,000 generations of new E. coli have happened, over that time period. Not once did it ever change to a different bacteria. 60,000 generations. Okay, so I think that's pretty, like, in a way. I mean, it's only bacteria, right? So we've never observed that within monkeys or any other type of animal. But if you can have a particular species of something never becoming another species over 60,000 generations, that's a pretty good case that, like, this probably doesn't happen.
Right? Evidence that dogs came from wolves. I mean, I know they're related.
Right.
But I still have a hard time. I don't know that I've ever seen actual evidence
that they were once wolves.
That they were actually once wolves. Like, sort of like what they teach in school with evolution. Mm-hmm. It's just like, okay, here's a wolf and here's a dog, and they're related. So we believe that a wolf just became a dog because people brought them into their house and fed them.
Yeah, I'd have to look into that further, but because I might be getting muddied up.
Because I don't know that I've ever seen anything. And I remember that there's a video series that Gary Pike showed one year.
Okay.
I forget what it is.
Okay.
But it talks about like evolution, and Charles Darwin was debunked many years, long time ago.
Right.
And it said there was something to the effect of like a lot of that stuff, a lot of these animals that they refer to that like evolved over time really didn't. And
right.
one of the species, or one of the types of animals was like there's some canary in the Galapagos Islands.
We're going to talk about the finches,
okay.
the medium ground finches. Yeah.
I was just curious about the wolf to dog.
Well, so that's actually uncontroversial. So you do see that actually within species, because that's still within species. Like, I think wolves are actually dogs.
It's the same species.
I'm pretty sure.
That's what I wasn't sure if they're just close.
I'm not 100% sure,
right.
But I'm from, because I grew up in a very liberal area and they taught evolution. And so sometimes I get muddied up with that stuff. So
I'm just like, okay, I just heard that.
Yeah,
but
right.
I don't know that I've ever actually seen somebody say, here's a dog, or here's a wolf, and here's where it cheated in this year.
That I don't know. But I know that like new breeds of dogs kind of happen all the time. Like I think when I grew up, there was no such thing as a cockapoo, not a cockapoo, golden doodle. I don't think that was an actual dog. Yeah, my grandparents got the thing. I'm like, what is? It's like a very large looking Labrador. What is that? but dog breeders do that sort of thing. Like they will change genetically, over very short periods of time. Like even in my lifetime, right? This is like 30 years. So you'll see it, and so that's maybe I'll just bring it up now. So we have microevolution and macroevolution. So microevolution is variation within a species, right? So the Galapagos finches, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that's an example of microevolution. So where you have the finches, or say the dogs, over, potentially 10 years or even less, where you'll have new species, well, not species, new variations of one species popping up. That's uncontroversial. Christian scientists, everyone accepts that happens. The big question is, are new species ever? Do you develop a new species? That's called macroevolution. So large-scale changes above the species level. So meaning that you can change from one species to another, which actually it's kind of an interesting thing. Never once is that documented. Really, they have their ways of trying to do that, which we're going to talk about, but that's never really been proven on the scientific level. So, let's see, was there anything else I wanted to say in there? I think that's it. Okay, so how evolution works, right? So, evolutionary theory argues that the development of a new species is made possible by random mutations in DNA. Okay, so DNA is some of you might remember, it's a complex molecule in cells, right? So specifically in the nucleus, that has all the genetic information that's needed for, whatever organism it is. And everything has it. Plants have it, we have it. I don't know if rocks have it. I think it's just all living things. Yeah, living matter. Right, so, but it's stored as a code made up of 4 chemical bases, which is, we don't need to know this, but adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. And depending on whatever, how it's arranged, how those 4 chemical bases are arranged, it creates every trait that's in our body, any biological thing. It creates all of the, from the sound of the depth of my voice, to the color of my eyes, to my hair, to my height, everything is dictated by this genetic code. So, and kind of what they say is that there's these mutations that happen over time, and they essentially accumulate to the point where you can have something that was originally a certain species, but after enough mutation has gone on, it gets to the point where it actually can no longer reproduce with its original group, right? That's it, but it's all dependent on these mutations that are, well, essentially advantageous. Right, so depending on environmental conditions, right, making a kind of the image that's always put out there is you have like a kind of a short-necked giraffe and a long-necked giraffe, and something happens, on the earth, and it wipes out all the like low shrubs, and the only thing that they can eat are the high, leaves or whatever. And so of course all of the short-necked giraffes are going to die off, and all the long-necked giraffes are going to live because they can reach the leaves, right? And that's kind of the idea, and this happens in all these different ways. You'll see with the Galapagos finches there was its own version of that. But the long-necked giraffes had a certain mutation that caused them to have a long neck, and therefore they survived by natural selection. So does that make sense? Okay. So if we want to know some of the technical details about how mutations happen, so you'll have a sequence of cytosine, adenine, guanine, and thymine, right? So CAT, say that's cytosine, adenine, guanine. And generally what will happen is either one of them is deleted, or you'll have some switching with the sequence. So instead of being CAT, cytosine, adenine, thymine, it'll be CT, so cytosine, thymine, right? And that's how the mutations generally happen. Usually it's a deletion of information, or it's kind of just a neutral switching of information. It's very rarely an adding of new information that they see. What else? Natural selection, I think I got through that pretty well. I think I covered that pretty well. So individuals with mutations that help their environmental adaptation survive and produce more offspring. So kind of like with the long-necked giraffes, they were able to survive because they had long necks and they could eat food. Okay, so Galapagos finches. So let's just kind of go through this. So this is Peter and Rosemary Grant banded and measured every individual of the medium ground finch species of the Galapagos Islands in 1973. I always think that's kind of like how do you know you got all of them? But apparently they did. So that's a lot of birds. So yeah, right. Yeah, right. All come. It's like Noah or something like that. But so in 1973, they apparently were able to band all the Galapagos finches on there. And in 1977, there was a major drought that happened, and it wiped out all of their food source, basically. So they had small beaks, and they could only open small seeds. Now, the drought was able to wipe out all the small seeded plants, but the large seeder plants were more hardy, and they were able to survive through the drought. Now, there was some genetic mutation, so there were some larger beaked finches that could actually crack open some of those larger seeds, and they were the ones that survived. And all of unfortunately, the smaller beaked finches died off. And when they came back in 1978, I think they recorded all the beak sizes of all the finches, and they noticed that they were 3 to 4% larger than they were, 4 years ago or whatever. 1982 rolls around. There's just a huge amount of rain that falls, 10 times more than the normal amount of rain. And there's this explosion of finches that happened that year because they're able to survive pretty easily. All the small seeded plants come back. And what's notable is that when they recorded the beak sizes after that, beak sizes went back to normal. So they went back to 3 to 4% smaller than they were when there was the drought season. So, and what's interesting about this is that scientists will actually use this as a case in point of evolution, because isn't that interesting, right? So they'll say that because of the fact that you can observe how an environmental change affects, cause this genetic mutation, this larger beak gene, to allow them to survive. Well, this is an example of evolution. This is basically how it works, right? Do you guys notice anything about that, though? That's like, why are you like?
That's adaptation, not evolution. So they're adapting to the environment, and then it goes back to the normal way that it was prior.
Right.
Meaning that was the normal way. Like the larger beaks was not the normal way that this finch was. Their DNA was.
Right. Now what's interesting?
Default was the way that they were
before.
I don't know how else to, yeah.
Yeah. No.
Explaining it correctly, but yeah.
You're right. So they're extrapolating. They're saying that because to them when they talk about
They should
evolution,
have all stayed with larger beaks. Then I guess is what I'm saying. But even that wouldn't be proof of evolution.
No,
Because
it's
it's still a finch.
Because I don't think they realize the
They did.
Saying that they
Right. Which and that they actually don't even say that. Like when scientists, yeah, they don't mention that it went back. But yeah, when I found out that it actually went back, it really does make a good case that like what's stable for them is a 3 to 4% smaller beak size. So that I found that to be interesting, but it's still only microevolution. When you're talking about adaptation, what you're basically saying is microevolution. This is something variation within a species, and for them to say that this is now evidence that macroevolution, that you still haven't proven that yet. There hasn't been a finch turning into a parrot. There hasn't been an actual change in species that has happened. But because with the way that they kind of conceptualize evolution, they kind of almost just assert, basically, without really evidence, that given enough time, macroevolution is just the natural progression of microevolution. They actually don't consider them in different categories. In fact, scientists don't even talk about macroevolution or microevolution. They're not two different things. Microevolution is just the shorter term version of macroevolution. But of course, you can't actually say that until you've proven that macroevolution is possible. So I think they don't realize that they're only making a case for microevolution when they say this. But there are a lot of people out there that will assert that this is like, solid evidence. And
they teach us in college.
We do.
Mhm.
When I went to college.
Oh, did
But they teach it in elementary school.
Oh, did they really?
Oh, yeah.
wow.
Because I remember going to college and
Yeah.
taking a class, and that was just
Yeah, it
what
was
what this is what it is.
when I taught second grade, there was books. There was
Oh, really?
chapter books, A to Z mysteries and stuff like that. Oh yeah.
Wow.
It's a given.
Yeah. Isn't that?
And like I don't know a ton about animals, but like I'm a huge gardener, and it's funny because like I look at this and it's like you can have different varieties of flowers and things like that.
Sure.
Like,
Right. But points to intelligent design, not
Right.
evolution.
Well, and the other
like
thing
they
is
adapt
too,
so that
like-
the species continues. Not
Right.
Well,
Right.
the interesting thing is like flowers, I'll just use that as an example. Like you can buy packets of seeds where it's like zinnias, where it's just a mix of zinnias, which is like their natural state. Just they come up in any color really that they come in normally. But like you can go to a special seed store and buy a packet that has all pink seeds in it. And even in that packet, you're not 100% guaranteed that they will all be
Be
pink.
pink.
And inevitably, I will have something come up randomly. One random one here, one random, and then if you go and save the seeds from that plant and plant them next year, they will come up
All sorts of colors.
It will not just be pink. Like, isn't that weird?
Yeah.
Which means that, again, the default of those plants, like they may have bred them and isolated them so they're only pollinated by other pink flowers, like, but then their natural state is the
As soon as
mix
they're
of
really
colors that
flowers.
God made them. Yes.
Right.
So, and like, it's crazy. Like, I just think, I see that you would have like an infinite number of different kinds of plants and animals, which we have a lot, I'm not, but like, can you imagine, like, if that was the state
Right.
of the way things operated? I
Nothing
mean,
would be stable.
Crosses of all sorts of things, like,
Yeah.
And I'm always like, how come we haven't seen that?
exactly,
Sure,
that's what I think
always,
too, like,
you
in
know.
gardening groups, it's funny, like, how somebody will, like, say, I'm trying to, like, I had a strawberry that tasted spicy, so it must have bred with, like, somebody will say, it must have bred with, like, a spicy pepper. And then someone will comment, that's ridiculous, that can never happen. And I'm like, right, that can never happen.
Right.
You can never have, like, one species of plant crossbreed with a completely other species. Like, it won't happen. Within it, sure.
Right.
You can have, like, a hot spicy, it looks like a hot spicy pepper, and then you bite into it, and it's not spicy at all, because it was bred or pollinated with pepper next to it that was like not anyway.
Right.
Like,
Yeah, no, it's
crazy to me. Like, I think of that stuff, and it's like it's fun to see what seeds come up,
but it's not evidence of evolution in any
not
way.
at all.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Right.
It just goes back to the way that the plant was originally bred,
Right.
to do anyway.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's I think that they look and how it's to them it's consistent with their theory, right? Because their theory is saying that genetic mutations happen and they can be advantageous, which in this case that's what you're seeing. This genetic mutation of larger beaks was advantageous in that case, and they kind of expand that into territory that they can't prove. They say that this also applies on the species level, which they've never shown that to happen
But I just
ever.
don't get how they dots. But then it goes from can't connect it. We're scientists and we can't prove this, but let's teach it everywhere.
Exactly.
Well,
Like, pose it as fact.
Yes,
not like
exactly.
Yes.
yes.
And cut out the parts that where we
Right.
can't connect the dots so that everybody else from here on forward thinks that it makes sense.
Yes. I mean, I think there's a larger agenda there, like a more,
It
yeah.
just blows my mind. when
Yeah.
you think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you can essentially debunk that God exists, you're no longer bound by him in any way. And I think that's kind of what our culture is trying to do. It's just trying to, well, God doesn't exist because evolution is real. And that's why to me, it's just like this is, even evolution itself is not hitting those 5 core biblical doctrines, but they use it as this kind of way to shoehorn it under and try to uproot it. But, and that's why I think it's important to address so that our kids don't kind of fall for it and see that this, even if evolution were somehow true, it still doesn't affect whether Jesus rose from the dead, ultimately. But we do want to address it because it will cause a crisis of faith because of how strongly our, major institutions, academic institutions, even medical institutions really push this stuff. It can be threatening to someone that's not expecting it or, just kind of a young mind. So, okay, so what's the evidence for evolution? So we have transitional fossils. I'm just going to quickly go through these because we're going to talk about each one of them in isolation. So transitional fossils. So what is a transitional fossil? So I have an animal that doesn't exist up there. But they think it might have existed. In fact, they might even have some evidence that this thing actually did exist. But what are they making a case out of this? Like what is the point of talking about this animal that doesn't exist anymore? So fossils, a transitional fossil is something that shows intermediate states between species, right? So they look at the fossil record, because we actually have lots and lots of fossils out there that just are no longer in existence, of animals that are just gone, right? Now, a young earther will say that they were wiped out in the flood, but if you're an old earther or a scientist, you're looking at this as like essentially a chronology of Earth's history with the history of life on Earth, right? And so with evolutionary theory, like you were saying, you would expect, myriads, just so many different types of species that you would.
Within our lifetimes, I don't know, maybe, but that's always their key is time.
Time. That's they.
That's why you never see it.
Yeah,
Yes.
given enough time.
Yes. Yeah. Given enough time, anything will happen. Right. But to get to all these different, because you imagine, so the first thing was just a single cellular organism. To get from a single cellular organism to, lizards, apes, humans, flowers, all these different types of variety of life, you're going to have all these forks. It's going to constantly split and split and split and split, and you'd see that splitting in the fossil record. And you really don't. They say that you do, and they've come up with these examples like this one right here. And just some things to note about what you would need to have it has to appear in the fossil record at the expected time, right? So say if you're hypothesizing that I need a fish to some sort of land animal like a dog or something like a horse or whatever. In between that, you would need something that was kind of fishy but also kind of doggy, right? So it kind of had both features, right? So it had legs, but it also maybe swam or something. It had gills. And that's essentially what this one right here is. Tiktaalik rosea. Okay, thank you, Latin. Which is kind of a hybrid between some sort of fishy animal, but also some sort of land-dwelling animal. And so they say that this is an example of a transitional fossil, of something that went from being a water-based animal, because according to the fossil record, it looks like at one time all life on Earth was water-based. Which actually, if you look at the Genesis account, that makes sense. But then you would also need an animal becoming, kind of transitioning from being a water-based animal to a land-based animal, and that's what Tiktaalik rosea is. And so there's other examples that they have. So Archaeopteryx is a dinosaur to bird transition, where it goes from being kind of a land-based type lizard thing to something that can fly. And then, not yet. Ambulocetus, which is a land animal to whale. So that's kind of the weird exception to the rule, where you have, because they believe that whales actually were once land animals because they're, I think, they're mammals. So they think that, I guess at one time they were all mammals, and then you have this odd exception where you have a land animal going into the sea and becoming, a whale. And there's this, I guess.
There's 3 examples.
These are some. There's others I think that they use. You'll see why it doesn't really matter the number. Although if there were only 3, that would certainly injure their case. but they're not. You should see more. I think whatever number they have, it's still not. You should have billions of them, and which we don't have that much.
Like considering all the fossils that we have, you would expect.
Well, we do have millions of them. We have millions of fossils.
Right, but you would expect to see. Oh, that's the phase where the whale was part.
Right.
Land animal or whatever, horse or cow.
To my knowledge, we don't have that specific understanding of.
Well, so they have like these. So Ambulocetus, for example, is like supposedly a legged whale-like thing, right? So where it looks like it's like it's a water creature, maybe it has a fin, but it also has structures that look like they should be legs. Okay. Just a sneak peek into next week, because we only have, it's already 10:01, so what you can easily do with millions and millions of fossils, you can imagine it would be easy to cherry pick, oh, that kind of looks like it might be a whale, and it also looks like it could be a horse.
Why wasn't that was the original creature?
It could very well have been, right? And it just happened to die off. It wasn't, there's no transitioning.
It had legs. And the legs.
Yeah, right.
The legs mean that predators more of a thing to grab.
Right, yeah, right. Because again, it's consistent with their view that we kind of started off as an amoeba and turned into humans and everything else in the universe or world, that you would need these transitional fossils, and they say that, well, these are them, but we don't know that those are them. Those are just I mean, honestly, the way that I kind of like to make it an image, if every animal on the earth, including humans, died today, and I guess someone would have to survive. Say someone survived, and there was no species, 2,000 years from now that went back and tried to examine it, they would be able to make those same conclusions. They would say, oh, look at this thing that kind of looks like a fish, but it's also kind of land-like. We would say it's a salamander. Because it can go in water, or a frog, right? Amphibians, right, can go in water or land. It doesn't necessarily mean that the salamander was transitioning from being a fish to being a, cat. It was, just this other creature that existed at that time. And I think that's one of the responses that intelligent designers will shoot back at evolutionary theorists concerning transitional fossils. But that's one of the evidences that evolutionary theorists will bring about are transitional fossils. So just be aware of it. It's something that they bring up, and you know what questions to ask if someone does talk about transitional fossils. Always ask what's the evidence for it. But we will continue this conversation next week with other stuff. Yeah, it is interesting. So like I said, don't have a crisis. There is a response to all this.